Okay, good evening everyone. Welcome to our evening Dhamma, Saturday. We have some guests, people I don't know. Did you bring all these people? Friends of Jason. Are they friends or family? Or?
They're from a Tuesday night group meditation.
So meditators. Good. Welcome. So Saturday nights we study, right now we're studying the discourses of the Buddha, as we find in very old texts. This text is called the Majjhima Nikaya, the portion or section of the Buddha's teachings that are middle length. So they're not very long, but they're also not very short. Some are still longer than others. And tonight we're looking at number 38. There's 152 of them. So we're not going through all of them, we're skipping, but we're going through the book. And number 38 is like another one of these ones that are particularly interesting or of interest to us as meditators, practicing insight meditation, mindfulness meditation. So there's not a lot of different concepts here, but the concepts or the teachings in this discourse are, you might say, profound, important, abstruse, in some ways a little bit difficult. So we'll go through it. I'm going to simplify it, of course. If you want the full course meal, you have to go and read it yourself. But I think it's useful to summarize it, to simplify it, because then if you do go and read it, you sort of have you get a sense of the bigger picture, of the whole picture. But we're mostly concerned now is how it's applicable and how we make use of it as meditators. Without worrying too much about the theory, how can we make it practical? Or what's practical about it? So the setting, first, this sutta was taught in regards to a monk named Sati. Sati, not to be confused with Sati, with a long A, Sati. I don't really remember what Sati means, but that was his name. And he was the son of a fisherman, which I think is important. It's not really important, but what importance it has comes from two pieces of information. First of all, people who fish are generally of dubious ethics, right? They're, well, not dubious. In fact, there's nothing dubious about it. They're murderers. But there's something sketchy beyond that. But the fact that he was, it's sketchy because he was born into a family of people who kill fish. There's already some suspicion here. I think that's a reason for including it. The other reason we'll get to at the very end of the sutta. The reason why it's included, that he was the son of a fisherman. And so this monk came up with a view. This view came to him. It arose, a pernicious view arose in him. And his view was thus: as I understand the teaching of the Buddha, it is the same consciousness that runs and wanders through the round of rebirths, not another. So somehow he got the idea that the Buddha taught a soul. Certainly the Buddha taught a life after death, but that the Buddha taught about a soul, what we now would call a soul, a consciousness, an awareness that continues, not just from moment to moment, but from life to life. And so the story is, the monks come to him and say, "Is it true that you have this? You hold on to this view?" "Yes, that's how I understand the Buddha's teaching." He said, "That's not true. That's not how the Buddha teaches." And so finally they dragged him before the Buddha. Well, they went to the Buddha and told the Buddha about it. It's a big deal, you know. If monks hold wrong views and start spreading them and talking about them, they may convince others of their wrong views, and well, that could be quite to the detriment not only of those individual people, but to the Buddha's teaching as a whole. Wrong view, pernicious view here, but let's call it what it is. It's wrong view. And so the Buddha says, "Is it true that you believe this?" And then he begins this sutta to explain why it's wrong view. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about wrong view, because it's important, especially in the context of this sutta. So something is a wrong view. What does this mean? I mean, this should immediately raise flags. Well, the skeptic in us all says, who's to say what's right and wrong? What's wrong? Why does someone get to say that his view is wrong? So a view is wrong. It's wrong, I guess, for, well, really only one reason, but there's two parts to it. First, it's wrong simply because it is inconsistent with reality. Right? For example, there's lots of wrong views in a conventional sense. If I say cyanide is good for your health, and if you drink lots of it, your body will become healthier and you'll live a long life, that's a terrible view, and it's very wrong. So it's wrong because it's just flat out wrong. If you drink even a small amount of cyanide, I think you die pretty quickly. Your body doesn't become healthier, it gets sick and dies. The second, so it's wrong, but it's also a bad view to have, right? So a view can be wrong not just because it's out of touch with reality. If I say London is the capital of France, well, it's wrong. And if I have the view that that's true, it's not really a view, but suppose I have some view of reality. There's some views that aren't really bad. You know, they're wrong, but they're not going to have far-reaching consequences in your life. They might make people laugh at you, for example, but beyond that, they're not that terrible. So wrong is in two senses. That's really all it's about. So the Buddha makes a claim, and he always has in all his teachings. He claims that the view of this soul is wrong view. And so he's mainly going to focus on why it's out of touch with reality. But I think it's important to understand why he calls it a pernicious view is for the other reason. This is a wrong view, something that's not true, that has far-reaching consequences. In fact, it seems to be one of the most important wrong views as far as its consequences. Because there are wrong views about physical health, but this is, I think you could say, this is the sort of wrong view that affects one's mental health. The Buddha pinpointed this. See, in many religious teachings at the time, there was a focus on craving, on desire. It seems to be not just a Buddhist concept. That at the time people understood, religious people understood that desire was ruining the world. I mean, now we say things like materialism, but we mean the same thing, really. If you look at the world, it's our craving and our desire, our greed. Our greed as human beings, you'd have to pinpoint it as one of the most significant causes of our own ruin as people, as families, as societies, as the human race. But the Buddha went deeper than that and said, why is it that people give rise to this craving? And he saw that, I mean, what we should all see is that without this concept of self, the cultivation of craving has no base. It's like you've taken away the soil within which it can grow. Right? When we talk about wanting something, we have a sense of I want. Now, it is possible to want things without having a sense of self, but it's not really possible to cultivate it, to make it grow. So a person who has done away with this sense of self, the idea is that even though they might have wanting just because it's habitual to want, they won't cultivate it, they won't grow it. Because for it to grow, there has to be a sense of me and mine. There has to be this sense of entities and beings and possession. So he saw that, well, craving is something that we do. We want this and we want that. It's true. But it's this view of self. It's what is the glue or the soil. Now, I think you might argue, in fact, that the concept of a soul it's much like the concept of a god. It's really the epitome of this idea of a concept. When we talk about the concept of a soul, I think most people in the world believe they have a soul, if not religiously. They have just a sense of it. There's me and there's I. Right? And of course this is what gives rise to arrogance, conceit, and preference and personality belief. I am this sort of person, I am that sort of person. And the belief in personalities of others, you're a bad person, you're a good person. That's what leads to conceit. Someone calls you ugly or fat or tall or short or dark or pale or stupid, smart, beautiful, wise, clever. Why do these adjectives affect us so strongly? It's only because of self. But these concepts, you can't really say that they're out of touch with reality, or they're wrong in the sense of they don't play out in reality, or they go against reality. Like the idea of a God or a soul, it's so pernicious and it lasts. It's not something that is likely to ever leave the world, because you can't really disprove it. You can't really disprove it. I have to be careful here, because you can't disprove it in the sense that it exists in a realm of thought alone. If I think about it, I think, well, when I was young, it was me thinking, and there was thinking, and it's still me thinking. It's not somebody else thinking. So there is a me, there is an I, right? I can, if I have those thoughts and those beliefs, it's true. I mean, it is easy to have the appearance of being true, and God is the same. If I say God is what's, running the world and so on, it's very hard to disprove that. Now, I think there's no question. No, not I think. That's not to say that it's not possible. And more importantly than disproving it, is, well, first of all, we show that it's harmful, that these views are problematic, and they're an easy cause for stress and suffering. But more importantly, they have at the very least, you can say, they have nothing to do with reality. And this is another aspect of wrong view, is that it distracts you. If you have a belief in, say you have a belief in the flying spaghetti monster, and there's this flying spaghetti monster that is reading your mind and can, all of your life is going to be influenced by this heavenly being. And so, as a result, you align your life with those views, and even if you're taught these things from a child, you grow up believing them, and it changes the way you live your life. It affects the way you live your life quite profoundly. And it distracts you from the momentary experience, what we learn as meditators to be reality. And this is, I think, why meditation in the beginning is such a shock. It's like uncovering something that was right in front of you the whole time, and realizing how lost you were, how lost we become in these wrong views. So the soul is one such view. If you have this belief in the soul continuing on, it prevents you from seeing what's really going on. It's totally unconnected with what's really going on. And that is, consciousness is arising momentarily. So the Buddha asks the most pertinent, I say this all because the Buddha asks a question which makes me think. The Buddha doesn't say you're wrong, and he does say you're wrong, but the first thing he says, when Sati comes and spouts this view, he asks, what is that consciousness? This consciousness that continues, what is it? And his implication there, he's setting him up. I mean, this is the way Socrates did things as well, right? You ask questions. The Buddha was, I think, honestly, and I'm a biased source, but the Buddha was much better at it than Socrates. Some of the questions of Socrates I can't understand, and they don't seem that profound to me, but the Buddha asks, what is that consciousness? And the implication here is that, what the heck are you talking about? You're talking about something that is has no basis in reality. So you ask about people's views, and it comes out that they're just spouting nonsense in this case. But his answer, he gives an answer. He says, that consciousness is the thing that speaks and feels and experiences. It's what experiences the results of your deeds. You do good things, it's what experiences it. So, Vedagata, this is the being that experiences, right? It's me who feels, right? It's, in many ways, it's just the wrong way of, or it's a certain way of speaking about things. We speak about things in our whole language. I feel pain. I feel happy. Every language pretty much has a subject, an object, and a verb, or a subject, verb, and an object, that kind of thing. It's sort of universal, the way human beings think about things. It may be why we can't talk with dolphins and whales, because they may think of things quite differently. Unlikely, they probably have a view of self as well, but it's all about the subject, the doer, right? And so it's quite a surprise, or it's quite a change, and it forces you to change your outlook, to think of things as simply arising, which is what we come to see in meditation. That really a better way to speak about it. It's nonsensical, right? When you say, I feel pain, it's an abstract. It's referring to the fact that, well, you're not experiencing this pain, right? But the experience has nothing to do with that. The experience is pain. Pain is a reality. That's the essence of reality of experience. The essence of nature reality is the arising of experiences, not someone experiencing them. And so he chastises this monk, and then he turns to the other monks and he says, do you agree with this guy? And no. And the Buddha says, because consciousness, they say, we've heard from the Buddha that consciousness is dependently arisen. And so I think, again, the most important point of this discourse is not who's right or what's right. It's more about what's useful, what's helpful. What is, and even deeper, what's really going on? Because any talk that we might have about self or soul it puts the mind in an abstract state where you're now thinking about things instead of living, being. You're out of touch with reality, this deeper reality that's going on all the time. It's not a secret reality, but it's hidden from us because we're so caught up in our views and beliefs of self. And so when we teach, when the Buddha taught about non-self and that this continuous consciousness that the soul is all rubbish, people would become quite distressed because we build our whole paradigm of our whole worldview up on this. We distract ourselves from what's really going on. Our whole language and culture and society and everything is based on this concept, these concepts of self and me, mine, I. And it's categorically, or it's decidedly different from what's really going on, which is experiences. Simple experiences. So it's a much better way of looking at things, of talking about things, to say pain arises and ceases. Consciousness arises and ceases. And so he says consciousness arises from conditions. there are causes. Why there is seeing, why there is hearing, is because of many factors. So there will be light based on light in the eye. Then there arises what we call eye consciousness. I mean, this is a simple way of describing things without adding anything that isn't readily apparent. The subject isn't readily apparent. When you're sitting here, you are sitting here, you can see what arises. There will arise hearing, an experience of hearing my voice. This is why in mindfulness we practice taking our experiences as an object. So when you hear, you would say to yourself, hearing, hearing. And as you do that, you become aware of this. Yes, it's true. It's the way it is. Hearing arises. You can do that with my voice. As you listen to my voice, just say hearing, hearing. It's a good way to listen to a Dhamma talk. If you have pain and you say to yourself, pain, pain. If you just focus on the pain in that way, you can see the pain comes and it goes. What's real is pain. An experience of pain. And so he talks about how consciousness arises based on conditions. Conditions are important. So arising and ceasing is important, but conditions are also important. I think if I'd have to say arising and ceasing is more important. I'll explain these two terms. But dependent origination. Dependent origination, I think, is what leads to arising and ceasing. And to explain, because the consequences of not seeing reality as it is. And it sounds very, very profound with that sort of statement. It's a very deep statement. And it is, but it's also very simple. Seeing reality as it is just what we do when we're mindful. When you watch the pain and say pain, pain, at that moment you're seeing, to some extent, reality as it is. Now, it's not very clear because likely, unless you're very good at it, when you first begin, it's probably not very clear. But this is the beginning of seeing things as they are. The consequences of not doing that is the misapprehension, this idea of self, the idea of me and mine, the idea of familiarity, and the craving, the desire for certain experiences and the aversion towards other certain experiences. And so this is really the one of the first things that you begin to see when you begin to meditate, is that this is what we're doing to ourselves, that it's based on, first of all, based on our attachments, our desires and our aversions, that we're causing stress for ourselves. We're creating disappointment, we're creating dissatisfaction, we're creating sadness, despair, all sorts of depression and all sorts of problems because because of wanting things, first of all, wanting things that we can't have. But again, deeper than that, because we see them as me, as mine. Because we have a sense, because, well, in many different ways, we're caught up in concepts. Money as a concept. Now, concepts aren't bad in and of themselves, it's getting caught up in them. The concept of money. I have so much money, I don't have any money, I wish I had lots of money. The concept of food, I want a big steak or spaghetti or pizza or cheesecake. I don't know why it always comes back to cheesecake. I say that and then everyone brings me cheesecake. I'm not particularly... Oh, it's a cheesecake, isn't it? You don't have to bring me cheesecake. It doesn't make me happier to have cheesecake. People bring me food. That's why I say that. But cheesecake is something some people are quite enamored with. But these are concepts. You get caught up in these concepts and they cause you anxiousness, addiction, of course, first of all. But addiction doesn't make you happier. It makes you more irritable, more sensitive to not getting your way. I mean, look at children. We spoil our kids most often, and because it makes them quiet, they get what they want and they're quiet. But when they don't get what they want, they suffer. And so really growing up is a lot about suffering. It's about realizing that you can't always get what you want. And so to some extent we do that. It's just a shame that we don't realize, for the most part, that that's an important principle to live by. That you can't always get what you want, and therefore wanting isn't something that's actually going to be useful to us. So we see causes, we see cause and effect. We can see the cause and effect of meditation. If you're mindful, your mind is suddenly relieved. It's released from this burden, from this constant oppression of wanting and needing and not getting what you want. Having to go through the drudgery of life just to get moments of satisfaction. And so the Buddha goes into a long discourse on dependent origination. Not long, but he goes quite detailed back and forth and talks about nutriment, nourishment. I'm just going to condense it down to an opportunity to talk about dependent origination. We'll give it in its classical form. So again, it comes down to ignorance. If you have ignorance, and again, ignorance is not ignorance of Buddhism or ignorance because you're not Buddhist. It's just really not seeing things as they are. Again, it's this state of having everything covered up. This obvious and readily apparent reality being totally invisible to us because we're lost in our conception of things. And because of that, well, we act to get what we want. Sometimes we do bad things, stealing and killing and lying and cheating and manipulating and all that, to get what we want. Sometimes we do good things. It's really quite random, I suppose. I mean, some lifetimes, I guess, we're good people. Probably sometimes you look at some people and they were maybe good for a while, but they fell in with bad company. Or it's a shame that we can't see the whole arc of our lifetime after lifetime. We'd see all this. It would really be an eye-opener to see what you did in your past life, right? People are so keen when they learn about Buddhism. It's one of the most interesting things, wouldn't it be? I wish I could remember my past lives. It's exciting, really, to think of who I was in my past life. Again, this is very much ego-based, right? Because we're self-conscious and we're attached to this self, and so we identify with those past moments that are gone. But we do good and we do bad things, and we've done this apparently since time immemorial. And because of that, we're born again. Because of that, there arises consciousness. Now, how does that work? So the first part of dependent origination is, it's easiest to understand as just a summary of things. How it goes from life to life. We do things, we act out good or bad things, and as a result, it affects our experiences. It's really the easiest way to understand it. So we talk about these deeds giving rise to consciousness. Well, that's what it means. If I hit someone, then I'm going to experience different realities than if I hadn't, if I had kept my hands to myself and practiced loving kindness instead. If I steal, if I lie, if I get angry, my consciousness, my moments of consciousness that result, that follow, are going to be different. Maybe I'll feel guilty afterwards. I said something angry to someone and then I feel guilty. That only came, that consciousness, that awareness, that experience, only came because I did that rather unpleasant deed. If I'm kind to someone, then I'll feel happy afterwards. That will be the experience that comes following it. So that's how it leads to consciousness. I mean, ultimately it means it's what's going to lead to being born again. So it's going to lead, but really that's just an extension. It's what leads us to becoming whatever we are. So our state, the state of the world today, is really understood in Buddhism as consciousness. We have created very specific types of consciousness where we're aware of things differently than we were before. We have to experience things differently than before. We experience cancer more often than before. So there's experiences of having cancer. We experience stress, headaches probably more than we did before, respiratory problems. There are experiences that, again, I'm trying to argue as relating to greed, relating to our actions as human beings. We have no one to blame but ourselves that we're in this situation as a human race. If you want to blame other people and say, I'm not to blame, well, that's fine, but perhaps wouldn't agree on the large scale, but it just means that there are causes. It's causally arisen. And so the point is, that's what's important. This idea of the soul continuing is just a distraction. Has nothing to do with what's really going on. That's how you should understand non-self and the idea that there is no soul. As being, rather than saying being wrong, which is really what it means, it's outside of the realm of reality. It has nothing to do with reality. It's a better way of understanding it as being wrong. So believe it if you want. Doesn't help. In fact, it sets you up for lots of problems, is the idea. Egotism, conceit, and so on. Okay, so because of consciousness, there will arise rebirth, and there will arise basically the six senses. So, well, you have the body and mind, really. As human beings, we have the physical and the mental. Not just body, but our experience of the world around us. So you experience soft and hard and heat and cold. So you experience the stiffness in the body and the release of the stiffness when you relax. These experiences, these are physical. And then the mental is the experience of them, the mind that is aware of not only seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, but also feeling, also the physical feeling. And that's how that's really the framework of reality. That reality is 6 things: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, and thinking. And this is the framework of insight meditation. This is what we are aiming to focus on and come to understand. And this is the second teaching. Remember I said there are 2. There's causality and then there's arising and ceasing. The real goal, I suppose, in a worldly sense or in a mundane sense in Buddhism, is to see that quite simply that things arise and cease. It's not something you have to conceive or understand of intellectually. I mean, it's really as simple as it sounds. Because what it means, a person who experiences what we call that all things arise and cease, is experiencing reality, what we are experiencing right now. It's the simplest and the most pure and natural state of existence. It's not some hard to understand or some esoteric practice. Right now we're sitting and we're feeling and we're thinking and we're seeing and hearing and so on. All of these things are happening. This is what's real. But because of causes and conditions, we aren't seeing that. We're caught up in the past, we're caught up in the future, we're caught up in other places, other people, our problems, ourselves, our future, our past, our present. We're caught up with them. And so what the Buddha is describing here is what's really going on. And all it takes, all we try to do in Buddhism really is to reduce our activity, or maybe focus our minds until we see things that exist arise and cease. Not something you think to yourself, oh hey, look at everything arises and ceases. That's not how it is. What it means is you're experiencing. Seeing is seeing, hearing is hearing, smelling is smelling, feeling is feeling, thinking is thinking. It's the most pure state because there's no judging, there's no reacting, there's no clinging, there's no craving, there's no identifying, there's no abstract theories about, well, I believe this, I believe that. It just is. And I think it has to be impressed because I don't think it's readily apparent if you haven't done this, that the result is so incredibly powerful and profound that it changes the very essence of who you are, right? It changes your outlook on life. It changes so many things about the very fabric of reality. Seems to have been torn asunder. And so much illusion is just washed away as that. All the problems and the concerns that you had, it's not that you solved them, it's that you realized they weren't real. They were just distraction. Anyway, I'm taking a long time to go through this, but I think it's important. See, there's a lot in here. Dependent origination, I think you could probably, if you were very smart, you could talk about it for days. But I'm going to try to sum this up. I don't want to take too much time with talk. Anyway, so based on experience, and because we're not seeing experience clearly, because of our ignorance, there arises craving. Because of craving, there arises clinging. Because of clinging, there arises becoming. We cultivate habits. We become something, right? We commit to things and we create experiences. If I want a big house, I read somewhere today someone bought a house for almost $1 million. And then their son died. I was just listening to this story, and then the housing market fell, and I don't know, I mean, it's quite complicated, but there's so much involvement there. Not criticizing this person. In fact, I think they had some fairly good intentions, but I think they probably also had quite a bit of greed that made them jump at the chance at buying something that they couldn't really afford. And then, of course, the reminder of impermanence. This is to buy something like that, thinking, hey, it'll be good for me and my son, and then their son dies. I mean, that's horrible, and you wouldn't want it to happen to anyone, but this is how life works. If not now, then later, or if not in this way, then in another way. Change, the very nature of reality, is uncertain. And so we distract ourselves with our desires and so on. Anyway, we build up debt is a big example. We build up this commitments. We get married or we get involved with other people. So this gives rise to what we call becoming. And ultimately, it's what makes us want to be born again. When we die, the clinging that's left over, probably a lot if we haven't done any meditation, that clinging is immediately, it makes us think, it's like as though when you die, you're presented, hey, here's a newborn, here's a new fetus, you want to try it, you want to do it again? It's like, yes. It's like we jump at it. We're so blind. But if you thought about it, I mean, life isn't, we might want to at least hesitate and think, life wasn't completely happy, But because we're always thinking about happiness, finding happiness, we ignore that. I mean, I think even intellectually, when you think about the idea of being born again, oh good, I can try again and get all sorts of good things again. Because we don't think about the bad stuff. Anyway. The point is not to say precisely that being born again is bad. It's something an enlightened being would never wish to be born again. But that doesn't mean we should fixate on this, because it's hard for us to fixate on it. It's hard to think about not being born again, not wanting to be born again. The only way is if you are enlightened. Everyone else is going to be born again. But it's a statement of fact that this is the way things work. And so the Buddha jumps right to the end. I'm probably going to skip some of the rest of the sutta. I don't want to take too much time, but he jumps right to what's really important by saying that when you have no more craving, you won't be born again. There'll be no more consciousness, right? And remember, this is all about this consciousness that doesn't continue. It's something that you give rise to experiences. And experiences cease when you have no more creating them, when you no longer cultivate them. But I think it's also useful to point out that there's a lot in the middle. And because it's so foreign to think about that, but if you think about the process to get there, what it means is that all these experiences that we have to go through that are unpleasant, right? Like a person who is, say, a thief, someone who steals from other people is going to have all sorts of bad experiences as a karmic result. In this life, in the next life, all of those experiences stop when they stop stealing. I mean, don't stop, but right, they're not going to continue in perpetuity because, well, you've stopped creating the conditions for them. And that's really how it looks. It's this gradual removing of experiences. You start to see, well, that experience isn't worth striving for. Why am I stealing again, right? This isn't bringing me happiness. Why am I getting angry again? You observe the process of getting angry, seeing it arising and ceasing, and seeing it causing stress and suffering. And you lose all interest in getting angry or craving this, craving that. You crave cheesecake and then you eat cheesecake and then you're full. What didn't make you happier? I had an argument, I was talking about this, I had an argument with someone about sweets. And it's really funny because, we just have the wrong way of looking at reality. You would say, sweet things make me happy, right? And it seems obvious because after you have the sweet thing, there's a feeling of pleasure. But at the very least, we can point out the fact that it doesn't, we can say there's a difference between being happy in that moment and being happy, as in I, as in the self, right? Not the conceptually. If I'm joking because I just talked about there not being a self, but about being generally happy, being able to say I'm happy. Because this person who argued, and he was not very happy about my arguing, and then got very angry. And that really is the point, is that the real point is people who subscribe to these views and follow them don't end up being happier than people who don't. Not necessarily. It's not a cause for happiness. Anyway, he continues on with that for a while, and then he begins to put it into perspective, practically speaking, and quite conceptually, in fact. He talks about beings again. He says, okay, so we've talked about experiences, how there arises this and that, and the nature of arising and ceasing. And then he says, I skipped that part. He talks about how life goes. He says, so in the moment of conception, he goes back to this moment, because he's going to paint a picture here. He says, in that moment there is the egg from I think he uses the word blood. No, it's actually worded differently. So the union of mother and father, because there was no medical understanding back then, but the union of mother and father, the mother is in season, and the being who's going to be reborn. But this is again conceptual, and this whole section is conceptual. It's not meant to say, hey, well, that means there's a soul that continues. He's not talking about that anymore. We've established that in ultimate reality and as a practical approach to reality, experiences arise and cease. But conceptually, there's this being who is reborn at that moment, who takes up you might say, the obsession with the newly formed fetus. Anyway, so after 9 months is born and becomes a child and grows up as a child. And so the Buddhist analysis of childhood is interesting. what is it like to be a child playing, grows up playing games. I mean, playing is what children do, right? Well, what is the consequence of playing? I mean, it builds up this worldview. I mean, culturally there will be cultural input, but sensory input and gratification. Playing is all about gratification, really. It's not to say playing is evil, though you might argue that technically it is. It's to say that it's reality. A person who grows up playing as a child is going to have this mindset of gratification, seeking gratification. It's tempered by the fact that you realize, they're not just going to let me play all the time. I have to do some work for it, but then you work so that you can play often. And he says this person grows up and basically they provide themselves with enjoyment, and because of not understanding, when they see things, they will lust after it if it's pleasing, they will get upset about it if it's displeasing, and sounds and smells and so on. And then they suffer and so on. But then there arises a Buddha. And a Buddha teaches anyone who wants to call themselves a Buddha is someone who learns for themselves and teaches this framework of this distinction. The distinction between living your life, getting what you want, trying to get what you want, and experiencing reality as it is, purely and simply, as it arises and ceases. And he says, for this person, when the Buddha teaches this, other people practice it. This person who was caught up in chasing after what they want practices it, and then they don't suffer anymore. Basically, is what he says. And then he makes a joke about Sati. I think it's close to a joke. It's a play on words more than a joke. I don't know that it's fair to say the Buddha actually joked. But he said, so you can understand this sutta as being called the deliverance from craving. But about Sati here, the son of a fisherman, you can know that he is caught up in a vast net of craving. So that's the play on words. This fisherman has been caught up in a net of craving. It's not that big of a deal, but I think that's another reason for using the word fisherman. Why they kept it in there. There's probably just a part of the story, and everybody was happy with what the Buddha said, I think quite reasonably. I think that's a teaching, and you'd have to read it to really know exactly what he was saying, but that was the gist of it. The consciousness is dependently arisen, and if you see these, if you don't see this, and instead you engage in that, then you get all messed up and mixed up, and you have to be reborn again and again, and get lost again and again, and suffer again and again. Whereas if you work it all out and see things as they are, it unravels. Your problems disappear, dissolve. Without clinging, there is no craving and there is no suffering. And that's the Mahātaṇhāsankhaya Sutta. That's the Dhamma for tonight. Thank you all for tuning in. Have a good night.